You are listening to Leaders and Legends, a podcast presented by Veteran Strategies, an Indiana-based public relations enterprise, and federally certified veteran-owned small business. I'm your host, Robert Vane, along with our producer, Chris Spangle. Our podcast is featured on the All Indiana Podcast Network in partnership with Wish TV. You may find Leaders and Legends at allindianapodcastnetwork.com. Thinking of starting a podcast or need to host a public meeting? Let Leaders and Legends LLC be your partner as you look for new ways to communicate your message. Please contact us at chris@leadersandlegends.net. As always, all our podcast interviews are dedicated to the legacy and generosity of P.E. McAllister. Our guest today, he was and is one of the most influential, important, and not in his way, but in a greater way, public servants in the history of Indiana, and that is former Vice President Dan Quayle. Thank you, sir, for coming on the podcast.
Absolutely, Robert. Good to be with you.
I guess I should say that I don't even know how many lunches or dinners I owe Anne Hathaway for making this happen.
Anne was my scheduler, director of all sorts of things for a number of years. So I'm very accustomed to do what she tells me to do. And she said I needed to go on this podcast. So here I am.
Well, thank you very, very much, sir. I want to actually start kind of with that. One of the things that I've experienced in my career in sort of the political world, which is about 30 plus years now, is you run into the same people, and it seems that many of us of my generation, I'm 58, thank the same people. Who were your political mentors, the people who helped you get to where you were or established a standard of public service that led you?
Well, one of the most influential people in my political career was a guy by the name of Ernie Williams, who was the editor of the Fort Wayne News-Sentinel. He's the one that convinced the powers to be in the 4th Congressional District of Indiana that at age 29, I should be their congressional candidate if we wanted to beat Ed Roush, who was a 16-year incumbent Democrat, a pro-life Democrat. So he was not one of those crazy guys. He was, center-left, a good guy, knew his son very well. So Ernie's the one that sort of got me involved in politics. I come from a newspaper family. My dad, mom and dad owned the Huntington Herald Press for many years. My dad passed away, and my mother sold it, I think, in 2004, something like that. So they bought it in 63. Do the math on how many years we owned the Huntington Herald Press. But he was the one that was very, very influential. Of course, he was, a very solid newspaper man of the old school. They were quite involved in politics in those days. The Fort Wayne News-Sentinel was more the Republican paper, and the Journal-Gazette was the Democrat paper. Now there's just one newspaper up there. So it was a different era then. But he's the one, and with the newspaper background of his, I'd say that he was very influential in my political career.
On the other hand, moving it forward, you obviously have played a role in several careers, both as a senator and a vice president and congressman, and what you do now. How much enjoyment do you get when you see someone who, we mentioned Anne Hathaway, who maybe worked with you and they were 20, 22, 25, and see they've gone on to do even greater things?
It's very fulfilling. Probably the best example is Dan Coates. When I was in Congress, I decided to run for the Senate in 1980. He was my district representative. He ran the district office. And so when I didn't go to things, or even when I did go to things, he was always there. But he was a great surrogate. He could go out and make speeches on my behalf. And then when I ran for the Senate, he ran for my House seat. And he was somewhat an underdog because a guy by the name of Mark Helmke, who is the son of a guy named Walter Helmke, was really had the name. Paul Helmke, later on, ended up running for governor and was the mayor of Fort Wayne. So he came from a political family. And interestingly, my mentor, Ernie Williams, in the newspaper business, supported Mark Helmke and not my protege, Dan Coates, which I said, oh, Ernie, come on, can you stay neutral? He said, no, I think he'll be a better congressman. And he says, he's done it on his own. And Mark Helmke had actually been a writer for him, a reporter. But anyway, Dan Coates won the House seat. He was in the Senate. He went on to be the director of national intelligence, a real patriot, and somebody I'm sure you probably had on this broadcast. So, he and I have been longtime friends. He and Marcia are great, great folks, and he did a lot for the state of Indiana.
I will take the host privilege for a minute or less and say that Dan Coates is the first the first candidate, 1992, for whom I ever worked. I was suckered into the campaign by Devin Anderson and Brose McVeigh, who are wonderful to me. I was a student at IU downtown, and they said, "Hey, why don't you come do some of this stuff for us?" And Dan Coates is probably the nicest person I have ever met in politics, regardless of age, rank, serial number, anything. So completely genuine, and I'm just a tremendous admirer.
Likewise, he did great public service, as I said, in the House and Senate. And then later on, Mike Pence convinced him to become the director of national intelligence. So at that time, I think that he was, for whatever reason, he was sanctioned against traveling to Russia. For whatever reason, he's still not sure why he got on that list. And I think he told me when Trump was interviewing for the director of national intelligence, he said, "Oh, since you're sanctioned to visit Russia, maybe I'll just make you ambassador to Russia." And Coach thought that was pretty funny. Obviously, Trump didn't do that, but knowing Trump, he could have done that, and it would have been an interesting situation.
I
Sort
don't
of
think
like when Marco Rubio was sanctioned to travel to China. So they basically just changed his name and said, this isn't this is a different Marco Rubio, so he can travel to China as a Secretary of State.
should note that Dan Coates was not banned from Germany as he served as ambassador to Germany
Right,
under
yeah,
George W.
Bush too,
Bush.
yeah.
And he has been a guest on the podcast, and he was wonderful, as you would expect he would be. You mentioned Trump, and I don't want to dwell, but things are certainly, I don't know that there's too many people who believe that politics is the same as it was when you first won in 1976. But also, I hate to say this, I use you as an example to say, well, you know what? Politics hasn't changed all that much because Dan Quayle got the living hell beat out of him in 1988. And since then, and I said, so how much has politics changed? And it's a little robust argument that we have with Republicans and Democrats here in Indiana. How much do you think politics has changed in terms of the rhetoric and the language and how people treat each other from when you first got in?
Yeah, we used to talk about going to Washington and getting things done. We had our core philosophy and the core values, core principles. I was considered a conservative Republican. I defeated in the House a center left Democrat, and then Birch Bayh was much more liberal than the congressman I defeated. So back then, you didn't have the extremes that you have now on both sides. Back then, the party actually played somewhat of a role in who got the nominating process, got the nomination, and eventually won. I can remember when I first ran for the Congress, I had the backing of the GOP in Allen County in Fort Wayne, which was key to my victory. Today, people run against the party. Mm-hmm. They run against the so-called establishment. So that is a dramatic change. The other thing that it seems that we're in a celebrity type era. Donald Trump is the epitome of that. He'd never run for office before. He'd never served in the military. He was a businessman, but he had that show, The Apprentice, and he was a celebrity. And he turned that into, winning the presidency, not once but twice. Today, it seems like, you get elected, by, the social media, which we didn't have back then. It's the clicks that you get on social media. If you want to get a lot of clicks on social media, what do you have to do? You have to be pretty outrageous.
Right.
You have to take extreme positions. Being mainstream, center left, center right, that doesn't get you anywhere. So you're sending people to Washington, particularly from the extremes on both sides, and then everyone wonders why things don't get done. But look at the dysfunction now. Congress doesn't function, government doesn't function. That's why Trump has become so consequential and so powerful, because the executive branch, they just, they can do what they want. There's no check on them except for the courts, because the Congress is somewhat dysfunctional, or some others would say too obedient to Donald Trump, which may be the case. But, we used to work together much more than we do now. I remember one of the pieces of legislation that I got passed was the Job Training Partnership Act, which took care of the old CETA program. You probably knew the old CETA program. We wrote this back in 1981, 82. Well, my co-sponsor was Ted Kennedy, and it passed the Senate 94-0, because both sides said, well, if Quayle and Kennedy agree on this, there's not much room for disagreement, because he was a liberal Democrat, I was a conservative Republican. But things like that don't happen. That was a very comprehensive piece of legislation, and it's still a law now, today. So the partisanship it's very unfortunate. People ask me, will we get beyond this? I said, yeah, we will. It's going to take us some time. You're going to have to elect different people for different reasons. Fortunately, we'll get back to electing people that are conservative, liberal, that want to go to Washington and serve and to get things done, rather than just get clicks on social media.
Which is more surprising to you now, the direction of the Democratic Party or the direction of the Republican Party? More
Well,
unrecognizable to you based on your experience?
well, I'm more at home, obviously, in the Republican Party, and the Buchanan-Perot wing of the Republican Party used to be not in control of the party, and today that is morphed into the MAGA wing, and so the MAGA folks control the party today. I don't know how long that will last. It will depend on how Trump exits, more than 2 years away. If he exits as a popular president, then MAGA will continue to be a huge force in the Republican Party. On the Democrat side, we used to have we call it the McGovern wing, the Come Home America crowd. Although the Come Home America crowd seems to be alive and well on the Republican side as well. So that's changed. The Democrat Party has changed dramatically as well. You can see the so-called progressives, defund the police. I mean, whoever came up with that idea? Uh, and
It had to be a Republican political consultant.
yeah, yeah, that's a good thought. But you can see that they're going to tax the rich. Well, that's sort of old news. They've always been for that. But the viciousness, where Mondami, the mayor of New York, stood in front of Ken Griffin's condo in New York City and basically said, we're going to tax the rich. It reminded me, reading about the French Revolution. It was so outrageous and over the top. And so they gave Ken Griffin's home address. And, he's personally moved to Florida. I don't know what he's going to do there. But also the Democrat Party used to be the pro-Israel party. And now they seem to be almost anti-Israel. I don't know what the polls show, but I bet you that, there's probably more than 50% of the Democrats lean more towards the Palestinian cause than they do the security of Israel. That is a huge change, because I remember I was always pro-Israel, and I was always dumbfounded that my Jewish friends, right? Basically, particularly the Jewish women, almost always voted for Democrat. Jewish men, less so, but still a huge majority. That has dramatically changed. And we'll see. I think that's unfortunate result for Israel and for our country, because I think our country is linked to Israel because of the values and the strategic interests that Israel presents to us in the Middle East.
You are listening to the Leaders and Legends podcast. We are presented by Veteran Strategies. Our guest is the 44th Vice President of the United States, Dan Quayle. He was born in 1947, spent both his youth in Arizona and Indiana, graduated from Huntington North High School in 1965, graduated from DePaul University in 1969. Did you try to get into Wabash and you couldn't get in, so you went to DePaul? What's the story there?
No, actually, I was a legacy at DePaul. My grandfather went there. My uncle went there. My dad, mom, both went there. And Wabash was not even considered. It was like a cuss word around our house.
I'll tell Bob Grand that, and a lot of the other folks I
They
know
that.
David Brooks and Mark Miles.
Well, the thing is, Wabash, they'd come down and try to stalk our girls at DePaul, which we didn't like, but they weren't very successful.
Vice President Quayle graduated from IU Law School in 1974. I must say, my son graduated from IU Law School yesterday.
Oh, wow. Congratulations to him.
It's at law school where he met his future wife, Marilyn. He served in the Indiana National Guard from 1969 to 1977. He was first elected to Congress in 1976. I'm going to guess that a law degree was not the most important thing you took away from IU Law School.
It was not. My wife, Marilyn, we met there. I think she was like, in those days, I think 5% of the student body in law school were women. Today, I think it's over 50%. But she was, one of, I think there's only 10 women, girls at that time. So I was very, very fortunate to come out of there with my wife, who we got married in 1972. So do the math. It'll be, 54 years.
54.
Who
else was in your law school class? A lot of the folks I talked to on the podcast, I was in law school with Susan Brooks, or who's amazing, by the way. I need to mention that. Or I was in law school with Mike Pence, or so and so. Was there anybody who went on to great things who you served with?
Well,
law school?
One of the other few women there was Pence, the gal, not Mike Pence, but
Linda Pence.
Linda Pence. She ran for attorney general or something like that. She and Marilyn were one of the 10 women at the law school at that time. Dan Evans was there around that time, I think. Mitch Daniels was later on. Dan Coates was earlier. So it's a pretty distinguished alumni that's come out of the IU Law School there.
I need to get Linda Pence on this podcast because I'm a friend and a fan, but my expletive deleted button, I'll have to be in fine shape if I can get Linda on, that's for sure.
I don't know what's she doing now. I don't know.
She was a very successful attorney and she's retired. You're right. She did run for attorney general about 10, maybe 12 years ago.
She ran against Greg Zeller, I think.
That's correct.
Yeah.
Yes, that's
Greg
right.
used to work for me.
Yeah. Very close.
He thought that she'd be hard to beat, but she wasn't.
Well, he came to Greg Zeller is another guy I was going to ask you about, who I know worked for you because he came to speak to my political science class when he was on your staff. As you get older and folks start to really make their mark, is that one of the best things about leadership, about public service?
What, seeing other people succeed?
Yeah, people who like I know who's been very instrumental in my life. Greg Ballard, Dan Coates, Murray Clark, all friends of yours. P.E. McAllister, who I'm sure you remember.
Oh, sure, I know them all.
And they were always very kind to me, and you never lose that feeling. Is that something you have towards the folks who worked for you? Is like, yeah, you're ready to take the next step.
Yeah, well, I've obviously talked to Greg a lot about it, talked to Dan Coates a lot about it. I'm trying to think. There's a few other people that end up running for office or getting into, very successful careers. And so it's gratifying. And when you have good, smart people working for you and they move on, you say, thank you for helping. Good luck. Spence Abraham,
Oh yeah.
who became the senator from Michigan in 1994, he worked for me. I think he's the last Republican senator from Michigan. So you take people like that. It's very fulfilling to see them succeed.
Forgive me for asking, please, but one of your most prominent staffers when you were vice president was Bill Kristol. Do you stay in touch much with him? His social media account has turned into something I never would have expected.
Yeah, I haven't really talked to Bill recently. I called him after I think his mother passed away, or his dad, his mother, I think, which was several years ago. I That's a big question mark. I have no idea what happened. It all started, and I don't know the answer. It all sort of started when he got pushed out of Fox. I don't know the reason there, but ever since then, it seemed to go sort of the other way. And now I mean, he's totally got Trump derangement syndrome, which is unfortunate. I saw he came out for packing the court. Really? Okay, they get four, then the Republicans get back in. We get four. I mean, how does it end? We're going to be up to 30. It makes no sense at all. He endorsed Terry McAuliffe in the Virginia gubernatorial candidate against Glenn Youngkin. I mean, Glenn Youngkin is one of the stars in the Republican Party. So I don't know what happened. I know his son-in-law writes for National Review, and I've heard him say that the conversation over family dinners is rather brief and non-existent about politics. It, people do different things. It's inexplicable. I have no idea, and neither do any of his former friends that work for me understand what's going on there.
So I'll give you an example and then we'll move on. And that is, as I mentioned her name before, Anne Hathaway, who runs the Republican National Convention like it's a lemonade stand in Broad Ripple. She's just a machine. Her leadership and what she does and how she makes things work in this incomparable time. I don't know the last time you went to a Republican National Convention or if you watched them on television instead, but how do you think about your friend Ann as the Pontifex Maximus of the Republican Party for a certain few days?
She really is. But she's extremely well organized. She's very smart. She has a lot of common sense. She doesn't mess around. She tells you what she thinks, and then she does what she says. So you do those two things, you're going to get ahead in life. But she's a she's an amazing woman, and done a lot for the state of Indiana, the Republican Party, and she worked for me. I think 4 years when I was vice president, and was a stellar performer in the White House.
1976, you decide to run for Congress. It turns out that you won, and not, I wouldn't say handily, but comfortably, maybe the right word in 76.
Yeah, we won. I think it was 53, 54% of the vote, so it was comfortable.
What made you decide to run for Congress 2 years after Watergate? That was the question I wanted to ask you. It turned out to be a decent Republican year on some levels. Obviously, Jimmy Carter won the presidency. In Indiana, it was a good Republican year. Why? Why then? Why not wait?
Well, it's very interesting. There's an interesting answer to that question because I worked in state government when I was going to law school. I worked for the attorney general. I worked for the governor. And I sort of looked around at all these people because I interfaced with the state legislators, state senators, and I go, these guys aren't all that great. And when I went back to, Huntington, with my wife, we practiced a little law. I ran the newspaper there, and I was thinking about actually running for the state house, or maybe state senator. I wasn't thinking about running for Congress, and that's when the county chairman from Fort Wayne, Allen County, Orvis Spears, said, "You need to run for Congress." And he had been told by my friend Ernie Williams, who was the editor of the Fort Wayne News Sentinel, that they ought to come down and ask this young Dan Quayle to run against Ed Rouse, because big names like Walt Helmke and others got beat by Rouse. Ross Adair, the congressman, was defeated by Orvis says, why we want you to run for Congress. And I said, Orvis, I said, why don't you get Walt Helmke to run? He says, well, we've asked him, he won't run. And I said, oh. And then I said, how about Phil Gutman? We've asked him, he's not going to run. And there's one other guy, I can't remember, was very prominent and had name recognition. And they said, well, we've asked him, and he's not going to run. I said, well, what what are you doing? I mean, you think I'm going to be a sacrificial lamb here? He says, oh, no, we can win. We know Roush, he's really vulnerable. Guy Helmke came really close to him in 1974. He only lost by 6 points or something like that. And 74 was a terrible year. And I said, okay. I said, well, I'll do it with two conditions. One, I do not want a primary opposition. I can't deal with that. If you really want me to run, you got to get me through the primary, no primary opposition. And two, look, you got to raise money.
Yeah.
This takes money. Well, Robert, those were the first two lies told to me in politics because
They're still being told today.
I had a primary opponent, and the son of a gun raised very, very little money. I had to go outside the party to raise the money for my congressional campaign, which I think we raised a staggering amount of $100,000 or $200,000 or something like that. But they just outright lies to me. But I ran. I won. I was good friends with Congressman Roush's son. That's how the age difference, and that's why we were able to win easily, because I don't think they really took me seriously until like September, because the polls, I was so far behind the polls. I mean, I took this state party, or someone took a poll. I announced in February. Someone took a poll in March, and I had 8%. I said, 8%? Really? I haven't even done anything. And I got 8% support. They said, yeah, well, the poll had a error rate plus or minus 10. So I could have been like -2 at the time. So anyway, and Ed Roush, his son, was the one that he was a realtor, and he found me a house in McLean, Virginia that I bought from him when I moved to Washington in 1977.
Politics has changed. That's right. Uh, that's funny because saying you're clear the field,
Yeah.
saying well, we'll raise money for you like crazy. Those lies are still being told today.
Yeah. Well, I was young, naive. I was 29 years old, just been married a few years. We had one child, another on the way, and they're lying to me.
Mr. Quayle was reelected in 1976, beat John Walda, who I believe was chair of the IU Board of Trustees when Bob Knight was fired. Is that correct?
Could be. He was the son-in-law of the publisher of the Fort Wayne Journal-Gazette. As I said, the Journal-Gazette was the Democrat paper, and the News Sentinel, Ernie Williams, was the Republican paper. In those days, you had Republican papers, Democrat papers. Interestingly, the News Sentinel was the afternoon paper and had a larger circulation. It was one of the very few in the country where the afternoon paper had a larger circulation than the morning paper. But yeah, John Waldo he was the son. I think they have since split. But yes, he was very involved with the Board of Trustees at IU.
1980. So I was born in 67. I remember Watergate summer. So a lot of things in the 70s, 76 especially. But 1980, I really remember that political year for a lot of reasons. One of them being that my mother would walk on hot coals from Indianapolis to Evansville and back for Birch Bayh. She thought Birch Bayh was the epitome of public service. Your run against him in 1980. First, why decide to challenge a 3-term sitting United States senator who had the sort of resume and record that Birch Bayh had?
I had been in the House 4 years. I had to make the decision just after my reelection to the Congress in 78. The Republicans were in the minority, and looking around. I go, we're never going to be in the majority here. Democrats had a pretty big majority. Tip O'Neill, was very gregarious and controlled that house. And I actually became a golfing friend of his. So I realized where the power was is on the Democrat side. And there was very limited power that you had as a Republican member of Congress. I remember I got a couple things through uh, the House, but it was very, very difficult. So I said, I'm sort of wasting my time here unless I want to become the ranking minority leader. But I knew John Rhodes, I knew Bob Michael. They didn't have any power either. So I go, what? I'm going to spend 20 years to become minority leader. I said, this isn't for me. So I decided to run for the Senate. I did say, because a lot of people were pushing Doc Bowen to run.
That's right.
And I said, look, if Doc Bowen runs, I'm not running, pure and simple. But I had buttons printed up that they took around the state assembly. A friend of mine from the state representative from Fort Wayne had it made up. Green buttons, if not Bowen, then Quayle. So that was the first thing that they said, oh, well, he's thinking about running, but no one paid too much attention to it because they assumed that Bowen was going to run. But, Bai was, he was bigger than life. He was good friends with Ted Kennedy, who became a friend of mine, incidentally, when I got to the Senate. Strangely enough, took me a little while for him to warm up to me because I beat his friend, but we turned out to be pretty good friends in that.
Saved his life in the plane crash.
Yeah, supposedly down in Georgia, I think, is where it happened. And, Bai had beaten Homer Capehart. He beat Dick Luke. He beat Lugar, and he beat Ruckelshaus. So, I mean, he beat some pretty significant people. And I decided I was going to run. It was one of those things, up or out. I was willing to roll the dice. I was 33 at the time. When you're young, you're got unbelievable confidence, huge ego. Nobody can stop you. That's where I was. I remember I was talking to a couple of the other congressmen when I said I was going to run. If Doc doesn't, they said, well, it's not your turn. I even had some of the people in my congressional district said, you can't run. It's not your turn. I go, well, okay, it may not be my turn, but I'm running. And they said, well, you're going to lose. I said, maybe. I think Bill Hudnut was thinking about running as well. Who was a very, very popular mayor of Indianapolis. So I just said, fine. And when Doc got out in May of 1979, I announced right after that. And so I just jumped in right away. And it's sort of like said, catch me if you can. And, there's a lot of people saying, what are you doing? You can't eat. It's not your turn. Others are going to run against you. Well, guess what? The only guy that ran against me was a guy by the name of Roger Marsh, who was the highway superintendent, appointed by Governor Bowen. But Doc stayed out of it. But I had all of his people around him, Ray Rizzo, Bill Watt, all these guys. They were all for me. So I had that all locked in. But not Doc. Because, Bowen was so popular. And Bob Orr was running for governor at that time, and he turned out to be very popular. And he was very helpful to me down in Evansville. That's where he was from. Because I was from Fort Wayne. It's a 7-hour drive from Fort Wayne down to Evansville. So it's like almost like another state. But he was very helpful to me. And we ended up, I remember they called that race very quickly. And Lake County had not closed, and Vandenberg County, which is in Evansville, had not closed because of the time zone back then.
Right.
But it was, because we ended up winning by 54% of the vote.
Yeah, 7-point victory.
Something like that. And we had I got more votes than Reagan. People said, well, how'd you do that? And I said, well, it's not quite what I say it is, because there was a guy named John Anderson on the ticket that got 6 or 7% of the vote. And that's the only way I was able to get more votes than Reagan. But I always reminded people, I said, I didn't come in on Reagan's coattails. I got more votes than he did.
So, I bet they love that.
Yeah, I do.
But did the fact that and I want to say something very quickly. I did a podcast about the legacy of Birch Bayh, a terrific podcast. And then I had one of his staffers on, to talk about a book. And in both of those podcasts, they told me, Birch Bayh staffers, and I've had Evan Bayh on the podcast as well, that Birch Bayh thought the 1980 campaign was the best campaign he had ever run.
Really?
Yes, they said it to me more than once in the context of, how did 1980 come about, the Reagan Revolution and all that stuff, Iran, oil prices, this and that, Afghanistan. And they said to me, on the record, on the air, oh, Birch thought this was the 1980 campaign was by far the best campaign he had ever run.
Maybe, I don't know. I do know that he agreed to 7 debates, which I was surprised because I wasn't really that well known. And normally, when you're the front runner like that, you give the one debate and done. But he agreed to 7 debates, and I remember the last debate we had in South Bend. Remember Jack Colwell?
Oh yeah, the writer from the South
Yep,
Bend Tribune.
yep.
Yeah.
He was the moderator, and I remember the question he asked Birch Bayh whether he was going to vote for Jimmy Carter because he was trying to get the John Anderson vote. And he sort of hemmed and hawed. He says, it's sort of like, I forget, like a baseball manager. You got to pick your batters and all that. And I remember injected, I said, well, I'm voting for Ronald Reagan. And maybe you're not voting for Jimmy Carter. I don't blame you. I wouldn't vote for him either. So he was sort of stuck. He's trying to play both sides. And when you get stuck like that, and, he couldn't even come out and say that he was really going to vote for Jimmy Carter. I go, well, internally, they've got to have some polling that says he's got to get that Anderson vote, which I at that point, I said, I'm in good shape, I think.
What did you see in a young Mark Miles in 1980 to run to be one of your top staffers, top advisors in your
He had
campaign
run,
against Birch Bayh? He had run Bill Hudnut's campaign in '79 for mayor reelect. But what did you see in this Wabash kid?
well, that was the reason I picked him is because he was so successful in running Bill Hudnut's campaign, and he knew the nuts and bolts of it. My campaign chairman, Dan Evans,
Mhm.
was very close to Mark Miles, and he said that this is the guy that you should hire, and it's somebody that turned out to be a very wise decision. He knew where the votes were. He knew how to put together a campaign organization, and we were quite successful.
When did you become friends with Mitch Daniels?
Came friends with Mitch probably, when he was the administrative assistant. That's what they called him in those days, chief of staff to Lugar. Uh, Lugar and I shared offices. I think it's the first time that's ever been done to save expenses and provide more services to the people of Indiana. We shared offices. That was an idea of Mitch Daniels. But I actually got to know him. He was very helpful to me in my Senate campaign in 1980 because the Senate campaign committee kept wanting me to hire these political consultants. And I didn't have that much money. Jack Hines was the chairman, and he says, you got to hire these people, otherwise we can't support you. I said, well, guess what? I'm not hiring these people. I got Mitch Daniels. He's works for Lugar. He's a political consultant. And they wanted me to hire all sorts of people. I never did. I used Mitch. And Mitch came up with a lot of, very good ads. I remember the one ad that the Bayh people had a difficult time dealing with was we did the research, and there was 399 agencies that were created during Birch Bayh's tenure, and not once did he vote no. And that was in the day when the government is too big, and there was no answer to that ad. There's just really no answer to it. It was brilliant on Mitch's part. He came up with that ad. And it's interesting you talk about Birch Bayh, but the guy, I do talk to his son Evan periodically. We've had lunch together, and of course I always kid Dan Coates and Evan Bayh. I said, you guys, everyone wanted you to run against each other. Neither one of you did it. Coates bailed out in when was it, '98. He called me up. He said, I'm not going to run. I said, what do you mean you're not running? You got to run against. You can't give this to Evan Bayh. He says, I'm not running. And then when in 2010, I guess it was, coach decides he's going to run. I said, "Why are you running against Evan Bayh? This makes no sense." And he says, "Well, guess what? Evan Bayh doesn't run." So I go, there was something there. I've accused both of them of having some sort of a secret deal. They both deny it, but there was something there. But Evan is he lost Susan, who was his soulmate for all these years, but he was really he was a good governor, good senator, and he was thinking about running for president for a while, but then I think he was too much common sense for the Democrat Party at that time, so he moved on.
You mentioned your friendship with Ted Kennedy.
Yeah,
Did you develop a friendship with Birch Bayh at all?
not really. He came when he was a lobbyist. Um, and he called me up once. I was trying to repeal the sugar subsidy, and he was on the side I was on. So he would call. Ran into him every once in a while, but no, we never did it. But with his son, I did.
Is there a Hoosier leader and or legend you admire most?
Well, I think the two that were probably the most impactful. I mean, Mitch Daniels was impactful as being governor of the state. I mean, he really was very impactful. And I think Dick Lugar was impactful as mayor of Indianapolis. And I think that those two, and they're very, very close. Dick's no longer with us, but they were very close. Mitch worked for Lugar. But what Lugar did for the city of Indianapolis and what Mitch did for the state, I think we're probably looking back on are two very impactful public servants.
You are listening to the Leaders and Legends podcast. Our guest is former Vice President Dan Quayle. I said a few minutes ago that the Bayh folks said 1980 was their best campaign. Was it your best campaign, or do you have another one in mind?
My best campaign was probably my congressional race in 1976 against Ed Roush. Ed Roush was a lot harder to beat than Birch Bayh because Birch Bayh,
Hmm.
I mean, he was a very, very liberal senator. And I think Evan Bayh saw that when he was the campaign manager, that he was a very liberal senator. Indiana is at that time was center left, center right. We had Democrat governors, Democrat senators, Republican governors, Republican senators. But in 1976, as I said, those are the first two lies told to me. So I really had to do it on my own. I put together a precinct organization that came out of the AFL-CIO playbook. We
Mm.
actually did voter ID for our votes to get out. And we knew down to the person in a lot of precincts on who had not voted by 4 o'clock in the afternoon. We call it a shoebox. If they voted, we took the name out of the shoebox. And this one story, this woman, she called this lady and said, "Oh, I see you haven't voted. Do you plan to vote today?" "Yes, somebody has to pick me up. I can't get to the polls. Someone needs to pick me up." So they go to pick her up and they said, "Oh, we're so happy that you're voting for Dan Quayle." She goes, "No, I'm voting for Ed Roush." "You're voting for Ed Roush?" "Oh, I'm sorry." And they left her there. That was just, she did not get to, maybe somebody else picked her up, but that's how organized we were. And we knew by election night, I remember my dad was there and we had vote goals by precinct, vote goals. I made my brother, because he spent half this summer coming up with these vote goals, and the precincts came in. The early precincts were from the inner city. And I saw the first four and we beat the vote goal. I said, "I'm going to win." Dad said, "How do you know you're going to win?" I said,
Yeah.
"Because we have these vote goals. I'm winning in the goals. We're matching. Even though we're behind on this, we're going to win." So, I mean, I was very involved in that and beating Ed Roush. He was a pro-life Democrat.
Yeah.
I mean, it was a tough race. Birch Bayh, it was a different kind of race. I had to rely on a lot more people. Mark Miles, Roger Ailes did my commercials. No, Ailes did my commercial secretary. Who did I forget the guy's name that did my commercials? So I had to rely on it. I had a panoply of advisors, which I never had advisors when I was in the house. I did it all myself. So it was a different kind of campaign, less involved just because you can't be. I was in the house. I had to show up and vote in the House of Representatives. Was had a young family and trying to run for the Senate. So there I was much less hands on, but fortunately I had people like Mark Miles, Dan Evans, and a guy by the name of Tom Moses.
Oh yeah.
If you remember that name, he was the head of the water company, and he convinced a lot of his friends to support me that had not supported me or supported Republicans in the past. He was for whatever reason, I think Birchby had done something he didn't like. I forget the details, but he got all of his business friends, including Bob McKinney, who was the chairman of the bank there and a former national chairman or a national committeeman to the Democrat Party, and he ended up endorsing me because of Tom Moses. So stuff like
Really?
yeah, so stuff like that was going on, which I had something to do with it, but it wasn't quite like the '76 campaign. Yeah, he got Frank McKinney,
Wow.
Frank McKinney, who tragically was killed in a plane crash, if you remember.
Yeah.
But half of the Indianapolis leadership went down on that plane, but Frank was there. But Tom Moses was the one that organized all the business guys, Republicans and Democrats, and he's the one. He did raise money for me. So I had a lot I had a lot going for me. We had you got to be lucky in politics. A lot of it's timing. If I had run in 1974 against Birchby, I'm sure Birchby would have won.
Maybe 1980 is the start of Murray Clark's career as a Republican operative. Do you remember him working on, since McKinney was his grandfather, remember him
Yeah, well,
working
he
in the
worked with
campaign?
Mark. He worked with Mark Miles.
Yeah.
Yeah, no, he was very helpful, particularly in Marion County.
I have some more questions here because I don't want to get out of sync chronologically because I want to ask you about 1978 and Leo Ryan
Oh yeah,
in that moment. But I texted one of your friends and he said, ask Dan about playing on the White House tennis court and quote, freezing our asses off. And that's Mr. Mark Miles. Do you remember playing tennis on the White House tennis court with Mark Miles in
I do.
freezing
But
weather?
Mark was a very good tennis player, and Bush had he used to go out there and play tennis all the time. I was not a very good tennis player. I was a golfer. I played golf, but I did play. I played a little tennis. Yeah, I do remember that, but it didn't last very long because Mark is too good and it's too damn cold.
In doing the research for this podcast, I came across something I did not know at all. And that was in 1978. You were invited by then Congressman Leo Ryan to go to visit Jonestown
Yep.
and see what the heck was actually going on there. Obviously, Indianapolis has a connection with the Joneses for their temple here in Indianapolis, just north of downtown Indianapolis. Did you know Jim Jones? Did you know anything that was going on? And what were your thoughts when Congressman Ryan and his entourage were ambushed and you could have been standing right there?
I know it was. I was shocked at what happened to Leo and the team down there. This is another example that might not happen today. Leo Ryan and I were friends. We were on the Government Operations Committee, and he was the one of the two or three Democrats that was working with me to try to stop the creation of the Department of Education. And we became friends. We worked hard. I remember he went into Tip O'Neill's office and said, "I'm opposed to this." I got Quayle on the other side, and Tip O'Neill just ripped him a new one and said, "You're an idiot," blah, blah, blah. So anyway, we lost that battle. The department was created. Reagan tried to abolish it. Trump has tried to abolish it. It's still there, much smaller. Education, public education, it's a local issue. It's not a federal issue. It's a local issue. So anyway, it made very little sense. So Leo Ryan comes to me. He says, "Hey, I need a favor." I said, "What's that?" He says, "I need for you to come to me to Jonestown or whatever they call it down there, because this pastor who's the head of it, he's from Indianapolis, and you must know him." I said, "Well, I don't know him." He said, I need you to come." Well, I forget the dates, but I think it was around Thanksgiving. And I talked to Marilyn. I said, "This guy, Leo, he wants me to go down there." I said, "I don't want to do it." She said, "Well, just say no." I said, "Okay, fine." Because I had a young family at sea. I would have been 78. we had 2 children at that time. The third was just born. Yeah, Corinne was born. So I had a young child at home, and I just said no. And he didn't press that hard. He said, I understand. And I told him, I said, it's Thanksgiving. It's got my wife. We just had our third child. Leo, I can't go. And then the rest is history. He goes down there and, that Jones murders him, and then they go back and they drink that Kool-Aid, and they all died in a suicide thing. It was just unbelievable. And I've always just sort of thanked the Lord, 'cause
That's right.
had that young family, and it was around Thanksgiving. I didn't like to travel that much anyway. Since I had a young family, I had to go back to Indiana all the time. So I was, not inclined to do it. But that was a Democrat relationship that I had that got the invitation to go down there, which would have been my death.
Did you enjoy your time in the Senate? You served for 8 years. I should note very quickly, in 1986, you won re-election in what was the largest statewide margin in Hoosier history at the time. You won by 22 points in 1986. It was a tough year for Republicans. Lost the Senate, lost House seats, but still you set a historic mark. Did you enjoy those 8 years? Were they fun?
Oh yeah. The Senate's it's a great job. The House was, at first, it was very enjoyable. I was, a young House member, just getting to know Washington, getting to know how the committees work, getting to know what's important, what's not important. But as I said, being in the minority in the House is tough. And, that was 76. It was almost 20 years later, they finally got the majority. So if I had stuck around, maybe I could have been speaker or something like that. With the majority, that would have been different. But then you had a guy named Newt Gingrich, and they were looking for young, fresh faces. So might not have been my time anyway. But no, the Senate is great. It's one of 100. Indiana's a great state to represent. I mean, the people of Indiana are just so fantastic. It's the Midwest culture, and I enjoyed that. A lot of people say, would you have rather been in the Senate rather than vice president? I said, no, I wouldn't trade that. Being vice president, working with George Bush for 4 years was, obviously the highlight of my career. But no, the Senate, it's a great, great place.
How much did you enjoy, and how helpful was it to you? Which he had only been there 4 years, which seems, kind of crazy these days. But how fun was it to have Richard Lugar as a partner in the Senate? And did you see like this? He was older than you, obviously, but you're like, okay, this guy he's got intelligence that's going to make a difference.
Yeah, well, he was on foreign relations, and I was on the House Foreign Affairs Committee. So when I went to the Senate, the natural position for me would have been foreign relations, but he was already there. So I took armed services. And now I think armed services, I mean, that decision was very helpful, because that was really the committee that people gravitated to get to higher office. I was on that committee. Al Gore was on that committee. Pete Wilson, the governor of California, was on that committee. Hillary Clinton was on that committee. Ted Kennedy finally got on the committee. So the House or the Senate Armed Services Committee was really where you wanted to go. But Dick had the foreign relations. The unfortunate thing for him is that I think the whole time he was there, only 2 years was he chairman, because there's a guy named Jesse Helms that was always ahead of him. And Jesse, running for re-election down in North Carolina, said he was going to give up foreign relations and take agriculture if he won. Forget what year it was. Well, he won. He took agriculture, but then he went back to foreign relations because he said he fulfilled his commitment. And so Lugar was, he was ranking for a while, but he was chairman for only 2 times, which is unfortunate because he could have really made a mark on that committee.
Thank you very much for listening to Leaders and Legends, brought to you by Veteran Strategies Incorporated. If you want to contact us about this program or our menu of public relations services, please send us an email at robert@veteranstrategies.com. That's robert@veteranstrategies.com.